You're listening to episode 18 of Liz's Healthy Table.
Looking for a healthy new way to feed your family without the hassle and hype? Welcome to Liz's Healthy Table, where your host, registered dietitian nutritionist Liz Weiss, serves up fresh and flavorful recipes with a tasty side of science, good nutrition, and fun. Are you and your family ready for some wholesome food that tastes great too? Don't change that dial. Your food adventure starts here.
Welcome to the show, everyone. Today, we'll be talking with child nutrition expert and fellow podcaster, Jill Castle. And we'll be talking about feeding styles and why it's important to get it right. Did you know that over the course, you're not going to believe this, over the course of a child's life, a parent will feed their child over 28,000 meals and snacks? Yet, you know what? Most of us get little, if any, training on the how-tos of feeding our kids. So what's your style? Are you a clean your plate kind of parent? Are you overly permissive? Or do you follow the love with limits style that Jill says is the best recipe for success? Jill Castle is one of the nation's top childhood nutrition experts. She inspires families to think differently about feeding kids. From babies to teens, she takes what she calls a unique whole child approach to showcase food, feeding, and child development. And those are really her secret ingredients to raising a healthy child. She is a sought-after speaker for parent groups and nutrition professionals. And wait until you hear about her TED Talk. I'm going to give you a link to it in the show notes. She is the author of Eat Like a Champion and co-author of Fearless Feeding. You can find her at her blog, The Nourished Child, or tune in to the Nourished Child podcast. Nearly 50 episodes strong. She's been at it for longer than I have with Liz's Healthy Table. I will link to Jill's info in the show notes, so be sure to head on over to lizshealthytable.com/podcast. And speaking of the show, if you love it, I will encourage all of you to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play. And once you're there and you see all those reviews, feel free to give me a review, a 5-star review. Oh, that would make me so happy. Only if you love the show, of course. Anyway, let's thank our sponsors for today's show, because of course the show would not be possible without them. Zespri Sungold Kiwi Fruit. If you need recipe inspiration, whether it's dinner, lunch, breakfast, snacks, head on over to zesprikiwi.com and you can like them on their Facebook page, Zespri Kiwi Fruit. I'd also like to thank Bush's Beans, my number one favorite pulse. Of course, I love lentils as well, but beans, yep, they're my number one because they're so versatile and nutritious. And you can learn more, get recipes at bushbeans.com. And finally, I'd like to thank Super Healthy Kids. They are my online buddies, lots of great recipes, meal plans, you name it. They do really cool cooking videos too. You can visit them at superhealthykids.com. So are you ready to learn about the do's and don'ts of feeding kids? I am. Jill Castle, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Liz. I'm really excited to be here.
So, Jill, you are a mom of, correct me if I'm wrong, 4 kids. Tell me,
right.
How old are they? And before we dig into our topic today of feeding style, I am just so curious, what is your go-to recipe? Something that gets all those kids, everybody happily gathered around the table.
Well, there are several. One is my homemade meatballs and sausages and spaghetti sauce. That's always a winner. And we do a lot of grilled meats, so that's always a huge hit in the house. And then the other, my really fast recipe when I'm in a crunch, is my beef in a crock pot, which is the super simple idea I've ever had. It literally is a hunk of meat in the crock pot with a little bit of water and salt and pepper and a few onions. And it's just delicious. Shredded over egg noodles with a side of green peas.
Wow, that is easy.
Mm-hmm. It's very easy.
I want to get the Instant Pot. I don't have one yet. Do you have one?
I don't have one. No. I feel like I have so many gadgets and pots and pans, and I don't know. I'm really in that mindset of simplifying. I use my crock pot a lot. We use a green egg quite a bit and a regular grill. And, other than that, it's pretty much your old-fashioned pots and pans, skillets.
Sounds good. And your kids are all teenagers now, right?
They are. Actually, I have one adult. So I have a 21-year-old and a 19-year-old, 18 and 16.
Yeah,
so
crazy.
They're old.
It's a lot of food. A lot of food.
Oh, yeah. It is a lot of food and a lot of cooking, a lot of cleaning up.
Yeah, yeah. And, you've been in the trenches for a long time, as have I, in terms of feeding kids for many, many years. And I actually just watched your TED Talk, and I know that you are a big believer that there is more to good nutrition than just putting kale in your kids' smoothies or, say, grilling salmon and serving that for dinner. I know that you're a big proponent of not just what you put on the table, but how you go about feeding your family, a feeding style. Talk to us a little bit about the importance of not just the food on the table, but your style of parenting, your style of feeding. Why is that important?
Sure. Yeah, no, I am a huge proponent of this, and I feel like it's the missing link in so many families' ideas of what good nutrition is. Of course, we have food and nutrients that are important, but you can make the healthiest of meals and be consistent in your nutrition and still have children that won't eat well, who aren't enjoying that process of eating, and who aren't developing a healthy relationship with food in the process. And that really boils down to your execution of the interaction between yourself and the child that you're feeding. So positive feeding is a big anchor and cornerstone of what I do. And I try to wrap in the whole food and nutrients, feeding, and even child development so parents can understand what to expect when their children are going through different phases of development and how that influences their eating and their response to the foods that parents are making.
Yeah, and we'll get into all those parenting styles of feeding in a few minutes. But before we dig in, when I was watching your TED Talk, and let's just start by telling me a little bit about your TED Talk. But the one thing that really struck me during your talk was you talked about when you were pregnant and how you and your husband took this Lamaze class because you were so focused on that childbirth day, the day I'm going to give birth. I've got to know how to do it. And you say, just imagine if we put all that time and energy and education into really teaching parents about how to feed their kids. Imagine what a difference that would make in the health of our nation. So tell me and everybody else a little bit more about that TED Talk you gave. I'm going to link to it in the show notes. And this idea of shifting from no education in terms of nutrition to really teaching parents how to feed their kids.
So I had the realization after I did have my first baby that, in fact, wow, if other parents had as much education and practical training that we just went through to birth this first child, if they had that kind of education in the realm of nutrition and feeding their children, I really do believe we would have far fewer problems in child health that we do today. And so I had this idea for over 20 years before I really, I guess you would say, got the courage and the mojo to put it out in the world, because in a lot of ways, we all have these great ideas and these, I consider that whole paradox of we give so much education to birthing a child and it's a one-day event. The average statistic is it's less than a 14-hour event. And the paradox is we've got children for 18 years and so many parents are out there winging it, trying to figure out how to do it, not really being sure of whether they're doing it the right way or not the right way. And I was in that position with my own child, my very firstborn, when we started solids. The same thing happened to me. Here I was, and the thing that was so powerful for me was it was extremely humbling to be a nutrition expert, particularly in pediatric nutrition, and be struggling with my own child. And it was an embarrassment, and it really rocked my world in so many ways because I thought I was supposed to know all of this stuff. It's a great story because it just shows you that just because we work in the business of health, whether we're pediatricians or nurses or psychiatrists or psychologists or dietitians, it does not mean that our expertise gives us the green light and the perfectionism and the success that with raising our children. It's not an automatic linear, oh, you're a dietitian, you must know exactly how to feed your children. I think we know a lot, but the reality is when we're presented with our children, they have a variety of different personalities and they have a variety of different responses and challenges with food, and that can challenge a parent.
So let's talk about feeding style, because there's 4 feeding styles that you talk about that when you look at the research that's been done, you look at 4 styles of feeding, and within them is sort of the gold standard. But let's start with this authoritarian style, this sort of clean your plate style of feeding. Tell us a little bit about it and then some of the consequences of that.
Yeah, sure. So I was raised with an authoritarian feeding style. My parents were both German back in the 70s, for me anyways, and I believe for lots of people in our generation now, it was the Clean Your Plate Club. You came to the table, you sat down, you ate what was given to you, and you didn't leave until you did eat it. And that is a very authoritarian feeding style. It has a lot of rules and expectations on the child for eating, and not a whole lot of concern for the child's appetite or their food preferences. So because of that, it can turn into a pushy, negative dynamic for children at the table, particularly if their temperament is a little bit more sensitive or even rebellious. So some of the examples of what an authoritarian feeding style would look like is if you reward your child for eating. So if you say, Sam, if you eat that broccoli, you can have ice cream for dessert. Or if you restrict your child's food or portion sizes or second helpings or types of food like sweets or junky foods in an effort to change their eating habits or change their body weight or even punish them. So that is another example of what an authoritarian feeding style looks like. And then the last one that I think is pretty common amongst families is that pressure that parents can oftentimes put on their children to eat. So that might look like taking another bite or finishing their plate or trying something new. And that pressure for some children can be negative because they push back. They might be rebellious in nature and then just shut down and not do what the parent is asking them to do in regards to eating. And then the other type of child who is more of the pleaser in their temperament might, in fact, eat more food, even when they're not hungry. So the parent might be saying, please eat all your broccoli or please eat all your potatoes before you leave. And the child might be full, but they're going to eat everything that their parent asks them to eat because they want to please their parents. So you can see that an authoritarian feeding style is probably one of the more problematic ones in that, the potential outcomes for children are they can become disinterested in food. They can be full early, particularly if they're a picky eater. They can have difficulty with weight gain, worsening of their picky eating. They can overeat, ignore their fullness, shift their food preferences in terms of valuing those dessert and treats over healthy types of foods. So it's a little bit of a loaded feeding style because there are a lot of potential outcomes when you use that feeding style. But the other thing I would say is that so many parents were brought up that way. And so it's sort of the go-to feeding style for a lot of families because they don't know another way.
Right. And, it's interesting. And maybe I had heard you speak at a conference and maybe you drew this analogy. You said, if you're an adult and you decide, okay, I'm going to have a dinner party. I'm going to have 3 other couples over. I'm serving all this fabulous food. And everybody sits down at your table and you say to everybody at your dinner party, everybody needs to eat those roasted sweet potatoes. Everybody right now, I don't care if you like them or not, you better eat them. And Meanwhile, everyone's going to look at you like you've lost your mind. But why should we treat our kids this way? We wouldn't treat our peers this way. So with the authoritarian style, you're really dictating what your child eats and not allowing your child to kind of pick and choose among the foods that appeal to them.
Exactly. It's more of, I don't want to say lack of respect for your child's food preferences, but there needs to be some sensitivity and consideration. That does not mean that you need to cave to your child's preferences and demands about food, because that also doesn't get you a great outcome. But you do want to have some sensitivity and consideration to your child's food preferences, and particularly their appetite and whether they're full or satisfied. Because so many times we're not thinking about that and we're just saying, eat more, finish your plate. I made all this food. Please eat it.
Right. Yeah. And we're concerned too about nutrition. We want our kids to eat broccoli. We want them to drink their milk. And we're not giving them the time to process it, try it, enjoy it. We're dictating what they should be consuming. I know you talk about sort of the gold standard as authoritative, but before we get into the gold standard, talk a little bit about the permissive style and the neglectful style, because we've all seen the permissive parent at the checkout counter at the supermarket by the candy aisle. So talk about the permissive style and how that can backfire.
Sure. So I kind of call that, when I'm talking to my own clients, I call that the yes parent. So it's a parent who says yes frequently to the child's request, might be even oversensitive to the child's hunger or their fullness or their food preferences. And they're really sort of catering to their child's desires around food. And at the same time, they have very few boundaries or limitations or rules or even expectations for the child's eating. So what can happen is that you find yourself in the role of constantly feeding your child. So your child has breakfast, an hour later they're hungry for a snack, an hour later they want another snack, an hour later it's time for lunch. It's that constant feeding. Other parents find themselves in the role of becoming a short order cook, where they have a child who is calling the shots on food and telling their parent they won't eat this, they won't eat that. So the parent is in the position of short order cooking or making their child whatever their child wants. And what ends up happening over time is that the family even becomes so shifted in what their eating habits are and their food choices. They become more centered around the child as opposed to the parent at the helm, sort of guiding those decisions around food and timing and rules around or boundaries around the kitchen. So that's permissive. And then neglectful really is something we have less information and research on, but it's really that parent who isn't too concerned with food and feeding and structure and schedules. Food's just not a very important thing to them. So they aren't particularly spending the time meal planning or shopping or being prepared with meals and snacks. And so what can happen to the child is that the child can become overly focused on food and ask a lot of questions about food, like when is dinner? What are we eating? Am I going to like it? There's this insecurity that can breed in a child around food and eating. And just also, before we get into the gold standard, the authoritative feeding style, a lot of how a child responds to the way a parent feeds them is anchored in their temperament and their developmental stage. So, but particularly their temperament. And I think it's so important for parents to understand how their child responds. For example, I have a rebellious number one in our family. She's always been rebellious. So she's not the person who's going to respond well to ultimatums. She needs a little choice. She needs a little say in the matter, and she wants to negotiate. But I have other kids in my family who are pleasers, and they'll do whatever I ask. So I need to be careful not to be asking them to eat more food, to really let them govern their eating with their appetite cues.
Jill, what about the parent, and I hear this question all the time, whose child doesn't want to eat what's for dinner? They hate it. They don't want it. Do you recommend that the child go to bed hungry, that the parent create a whole new meal for that child, or is there a better way? How do you handle that scenario? Because I can imagine the permissive parent, like you just said, who's going to just suddenly create a whole new meal.
Right, right. That's why I believe the family style feeding approach is really powerful for families who are faced with this challenge. And serving meals family style is like if you ever watched The Waltons or you have meals, you go to an Italian restaurant where they serve their meals family style, it's basically putting all the food items on the menu in the center of the table and letting all the members of the table pass the foods around and pick and choose what they want to eat from what's being served. So, of course, we want a balanced meal with representation of all the food groups or as many food groups as we can have. And we also want parents to consider their children's preferences and try to include at least 1 or 2 items on the table that they know that child will eat. So for a picky child, that might be a pitcher of milk, or it might be a bowl of their favorite fruit or a mixed fruit salad, or it might be just some crackers or some slices of bread and butter. But considering what that picky child will eat is part of the success plan, but the other part of it is preparing meals that are a little bit varied in their content so that we're actually nudging very gently these picky eaters to be exposed to different foods and to also support them in the process of mealtime so that they know that there's something on the table that they can eat, but that they are also challenged by the presence and the smells and the fact that everybody else is eating these other items on the menu.
And it also offers that opportunity for role modeling or for an older sibling to take that extra spoonful of broccoli, and then the younger sibling who might be a little picky sees that. Mm-hmm. I know in the case of my boys when they were younger, if Josh ate everything at the table, which he did, he was a pretty good eater, Simon would just follow along, right? Everything the big brother does, he wanted to do. So I agree with that family style. You know, I got a question here from Jean. She is in my closed Facebook group, the Podcast Posse, that anybody listening, including you, anybody is welcome to join. And Jean says, I have a 6-year-old who is a great eater, always has been. He loves fresh fruit and vegetables, but our little one, who is 17 months old, is a horribly picky eater. He loves processed foods, which we turn to in desperation to get him to eat something solid. Any tips that you can share with us, my friend? Do tell.
Yes, I mean, I think 17 months is such a great age because they're new eaters for the most part. And so oftentimes more open to at least trying things and being explorative. But the other part of it is you want to strike that balance. I mean, if a child has already been eating quite a few processed foods or convenient foods, you want to sort of steer away from that gradually and just by substituting different things. I don't ever advocate, wiping the slate clean and just getting rid of everything that a child is comfortable eating, but really giving some thoughtful consideration as to how often you really want to be offering those types of foods and where you can make substitutions that are reasonable. So if a child doesn't like fruits and vegetables, particularly a toddler, don't get too discouraged because they come around over time with consistent exposure and being persistent. There's a couple of studies that have been done, one in particular that I remember, that looks at how many times a child needs to be exposed. And I know we toss around numbers, at least 15. Some studies say up to 50 exposures. Mm-hmm. It's variable depending on the picky eater. But the point is exposure and repeated exposure is the key to helping children get used to new foods and be willing to try them. And the irony is that so many parents give up offering these new foods after 4 rejections. So there's quite a gap. If a child needs 15 to 20 exposures and parents give up on apple slices after 4 exposures, you can see that some children just need more opportunities. So I would advise your reader to hang in there and just keep on offering a variety of different foods and not have an emotional response when your toddler decides they don't want to eat it. Just kind of shrug your shoulders and say, we'll do this next time. I mean, it's not a big deal.
Right.
And I wouldn't make it a big deal.
Is that the number one question you get when counseling parents? Is picky eating the number one challenge, or is there something else that jumps out?
Picky eating is a big one. So is unhealthy eating and eating too much. Those are probably the top three that I get that clients come to me for.
Right. And if a child's eating too much and you start restricting, that can backfire.
Exactly. And so that's where I end up trying to help families more with understanding how to allow their children to regulate their own eating and set up the environment that is encouraging healthy eating without pressure, without restriction, without rewarding, and really sort of fine-tuning the parent's approach. And oftentimes I do find this, Liz, that, so much of the concern that families have about their children's weight or the fact that they're not eating healthy is just a reset of expectations for them and helping them understand that that feeding interaction is really important to helping them learn to eat well over time. And then it's not a race, it's a marathon. I mean, it really is years and years of just doing it in the most positive way that you can and being that role model and showcasing balanced, healthy meals along with healthy ways to fit in foods that a family might not consider to be healthy.
I remember when the boys were a little bit younger, they would come home after school, they might bring some friends. I would always make fruit smoothies. I think I was sort of known for that because everybody was hungry, everybody was thirsty. I would make smoothies, and then put out cheese and crackers, veggies and dip. And that was what was there. And they all loved it. And so sometimes just putting it out there, don't even say anything. That's what's out there. They're hungry. I always say to parents, too, wait till your kids are teenagers. You will not be complaining about picky eating. You will be complaining that you cannot keep your refrigerator stocked for more than a day.
Right.
So
That's right.
One
of the things I see a lot these days, particularly with moms and dads of younger children, is the question that they ask their young children. What would you like to eat? What do you want for lunch? What do you want for breakfast? What do you want for a snack? And I'm always like, do not ask your child what they want to eat. You tell your child what you have for them to eat. So it's a complete mind shift and a different approach to feeding kids. It's really putting parents at the helm of being in charge and feeling empowered to be in charge and knowledgeable to be in charge so that they can do it well and feel good about it.
That's what you say is the authoritative feeding style, which is the go-to if you want to be successful around the table. So talk us through this authoritative. It's not authoritarian, it's authoritative, which sounds to me like you're in control, but you're not a dictator. So talk us through that one.
Exactly. I like to call it the love with limits feeding style. So it's when a parent is responsive to their child's appetite and the food preferences, but they give their child a voice. They let their child have what we call reasonable choice. So it's not, what do you want for snack? It's, I have cheese and crackers, or you can have a bowl of cereal with milk. Which would you like? So you're giving two options. It's also anchored in having structured meal times and snacks. So that means having meals on a schedule. So breakfast, lunch, dinner pretty much happen at relatively the same time every day, in the same location, under the same sort of environmental aspects. So no TV, whatever your environment is. But it's pretty predictable and timely. And then last, it's also anchored in having boundaries and limits. So rules around eating and rules about food, and not onerous negative rules, but rules that support your child's ability to eat well and to learn how to eat well. So things like the kitchen's closed between mealtime and snacks. So you don't get to run into the pantry and choose whatever you want or open the refrigerator and help yourself. There's a rule there. The kitchen's closed. And when parents can adopt the authoritative feeding style, we know that kids, the studies tell us anyways, that kids are better at regulating their eating. They're at a healthier weight, and they eat a better balance of nutritious foods. They're also more active. So it's a pretty good way of parenting a child around food.
Is the no thank you bite a good idea, a bad idea, or is it the way you frame it? In other words, you're at the table and everybody takes a no thank you bite. They could say, thank you, I want more, or no thank you, I don't like this. Is that a do, a don't, or is there a way to structure it in a good way?
Right. I think that we all like these black and white answers, and a lot of parents are looking for the no thank you bite is okay to do, or no, you should never do that. It really depends on the child. And this is where understanding your child's temperament really comes in handy, because again, if you are making your child have a no thank you bite and you've got a child who's rebellious, or who just in terms of their temperament, or might be more of a no temperament, whereas that, the child has a negative reaction to everything you ask them. Their initial reaction is no. That's not going to go over so well with that temperament. If you have a child who's a pleaser, a no thank you bite could be perfectly fine. So I think it's really on parents to think about what child they have in front of them. And I can tell you from having 4 children, I'm sure you probably feel the same way with having your children. Every child has a different personality, and that includes around food as well.
Yeah, and sometimes even with my boys, it was more of a game. Like the way I would structure that is I would say, hey, I've just made this beef stew for dinner. Do you think it needs a little more salt? Do you think it needs more pepper? What do you guys think? Taste it. I need some help here. And all of a sudden, they're intrigued. They're curious. It's a science project, and off they go. They try it. Or,
Absolutely.
Cooking with kids. We talk about that a lot here on my podcast. And so, yeah, I agree. It is, who is your child? How will they respond to that? Is it a game, or does it suddenly feel like a punishment? And I think that's definitely key. Now, Jill, you've got a podcast called The Nourished Child, and I talked about it in the intro to the show. But can you tell everybody a little bit more about your podcast?
Sure. Thank you for asking. It's a podcast about childhood nutrition and feeding kids and helping parents raise them so they are self-regulated, have a healthy relationship with food, and are healthy inside and out. So I like to say inside and out, because I think for many of us in the United States, we look at the exterior appearance of a person and we decide whether they are healthy or not. But there can be a lot of unhealthy stuff happening on the inside, mentally, even physically. So my goal is to help parents really think about all the different things that go into nourishing children and help them check all the boxes, not just for food and nutrients and for feeding, but to even make sure that they're helping their child self-regulate so that they can have an adulthood of health and have a great relationship with food, love to eat. And when I say that, I mean, I want kids to love food. I want them to enjoy eating. I don't want them to have hang-ups about food or fears about food. So there's a lot that goes into it. But yes, that's what my podcast is focused on, is helping parents be better feeders so they can nourish their children inside and out.
And people can find your podcast at jillcastle.com/podcast, right?
Yes.
Excellent. Oh, I wanted to share this quote I got. With my podcast posse, I always tell everybody who's coming up on the show, who I'm about to interview. So Jean had posted that question about her picky 17-month-old. But Suzanne here posted a comment, and she said, I have 3 kids, a 7-year-old, 4-year-old, and a 1-year-old. I feed them with whole, real home-cooked meals. Every meal they have a fruit and a veggie with it. I eat the same. If I wouldn't give it to my kids, I'm not eating it either. We also cook together. We even make homemade pasta sometimes. We have meals together. We have our rules, no TV, no phone. And when they go to Nana's, yes, they eat cookies, but it's a treat, and I'm okay with that. They are kids and everything in moderation. When I read her comment, I thought, she's got that authoritative style. She's nailed it, right?
Yep. She's on the right track for sure.
And I love how she's not upset with Nana either. So it's you got
I know. I just feel like children need to know how to navigate sweets. And I think that when you approach sweets from a black and white standpoint, they're either good or they're bad, or you can have them or you can never have them. I just think that there's that more gray middle that, they actually can be a very delicious, nurturing part of eating. And I think it's perfectly fine to allow children to have sweets in their diet. The crux of the issue is finding the balance that is the right balance for your family. And that's where it sounds like your reader, I think you said Suzanne was her name, she's figured that out. She's figured out the balance that she's comfortable with. Her kids are thriving and feeling good about that balance. And that's really what it's all about.
Right. And we want kids to have fun at the table, and we want parents not to feel stressed out. So I think your tips are definitely like right in line. And to me, the missing link, we talk about nutrition. You could serve kale all day, but it's the way it's presented. Jill, I always like to ask my guests about their favorite cookbook. What is your favorite cookbook right now? It might relate to what we're talking about today, or it could just be a book that is on your bookshelf that you think, gosh, everybody should have this book.
Right. Well, I have every cookbook Ina Garten ever put out. And so she is by far my favorite and my go-to. And yeah, I couldn't even pick out one because I use all of hers for a variety of different things. But I just really love her recipes. They're very tasty. They might not be the healthiest, but again, throw in a big salad and a bowl of fruit on the side, and you can healthify just about any meal.
Okay. So you don't feel badly if you add a stick of butter here and there?
No.
Good.
No, I don't.
Good. And what about a cookbook author or a chef? Is there someone out there that you'd love to meet that you've never met before, but gosh, you wish you had?
Well, I'd love to meet Ina, but I'd also love to meet Mark Bittman. Have you met him?
I haven't personally met him, but I went to a talk that he gave. He was working with the Union for Concerned Scientists at Harvard. He did a fellowship with them last year, and I went to a lecture he gave, which was fantastic. And he talked about the farming system currently in this country, this large agricultural system that we have, and talked about ways that we can kind of revamp that, his wish for that, for restructuring our farming system. And I thoroughly enjoyed hearing him speak. And I kept looking at him. I'm like, am I making eye contact with him? Does he know who I am? I'm like, of course he doesn't. You're delusional.
He was checking you out.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure about that. It was actually right after the election, and the Union for Concerned Scientists, there'd been a lot of research going on there about the future of farming. And they were really hoping that they'd be able to move forward with that. And there was a sense in the room that that was not going to happen in the current climate in Washington. So it'll be interesting to sort of see where things go with modern agriculture and if we see a shift. But yeah, he is quite an interesting guy. And I think he's really paved the way for vegan cooking and just feeling more comfortable in the kitchen, right? A lot of parents don't even feel comfortable cooking. So it makes good nutrition hard for them, right?
Oh, yeah. That's why I love his book, How to Cook Everything. For that reason, it's just, it's a great resource to go to when you're curious about how to do something that you have in your mind. But yeah, for parents, cooking can be a real barrier to feeding their children well. And I think you do such a great job, Liz, with sort of making feeding and cooking much simpler. And I really do believe that that's a key to helping empower parents to feed their children and their families better, is that confidence around cooking.
Right. And, it's sometimes best just to keep it simple. Roasting vegetables, to me, nothing better. Jill, anything else you want to share with us before we sign off today?
The only thing I would say is that I would love for your listeners to head over to my blog, and I would love for them to join me on the podcast. And that's it. I mean, I have just a lot of resources on childhood nutrition, feeding, and food and nutrients. And would love for your listeners to contact me if they have any questions.
Well, I know they will, and I will definitely be sharing lots of links in the show notes. So I encourage everybody to head on over to liz'shealthytable.com/podcast for all the scoop from today's show. Thanks, Jill.
Thank you, Liz.
Well, I've been wanting to have Jill on my show for so long, and I'm really excited she was here because you know what? Figuring out how to feed your kids is just such an important component in being successful when it comes to good nutrition. As always, I encourage everybody to visit lizshealthytable.com. Join the podcast posse on Facebook if you're not already a member. Subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher Radio, Google Play. There are many ways to subscribe, many ways to listen. If you're loving the show, post a review. I would love it. It would really help to spread the news about the podcast. And until next time, thanks for listening to Liz's Healthy Table.